Oh, hold on a second. We haven't started yet.
Of course. Thanks, Mark. Welcome to those in attendance at the remote meeting of the local review body of Aberdeen City Council. Please note that the meeting will be recorded and published online for the public access after the meeting. And all attendees, well, I don't require you to switch off your cameras, but if you could mute your microphones and not speaking, the camera and microphone should only be switched on, as I say, microphone when you're invited to speak. I will now ask the clerk to undertake a roll call for the members participating today, for all members to confirm their attendance once their name has been announced by the clerk, so it's clear in the recording and for the minutes meeting. Gosh, I'm having one of those days I can't even read today. The recording of the meeting and can also be recorded by the clerk for the minutes. As the local review body contains quasi-judicial business, members are reminded that they should not leave the room or meeting during consideration of the application. Can I ask Mark, do you go through the roll call, please? Mark? Mr. Massey?
Sorry, I switched off my my microphone. So for the first item, which will be 25 Westfield Terrace, we have Councillor Bolton.
Here.
Councillor Bell.
Here.
And Councillor Duncan.
Here.
Thank you. I'll hand back to the chairperson.
Okay, thanks. This meeting has been convened in response to 3 requests for a review of the decisions taken by the appointed officer under the council scheme of delegation. Members of the local review body have before them copies of the review documents as listed on the calling notice for the meeting, and I, Councillor Bolton, will be the chairperson. I will now ask Mr. Masson, the assistant clerk, to outline the procedure to be followed in conducting these reviews. Mr. Masson.
Thank you, chairperson. Members have the procedure note which was circulated with the meeting papers and is intended to set out the wider framework within which the review process operates. From this, it is clear that the first task for the review body is to come to a decision on whether the review documents contain sufficient information for the case to be determined without further procedure. And by that, it is meant without further information or representations. To assist, I feel it would be helpful to mention the following. Firstly, that the regulations governing the local review process require that all matters which the applicant intends to raise in the review must be set out in or accompany the notice of review. Secondly, that the focus of the review should be on the basis of what was before the appointed officer when a decision was made, and only in exceptional circumstances will new or additional matters be permitted to be taken into account. Thirdly, to note that the modernisation of the planning system, which included revisal of the planning appeals process, of which this local review body is part, removed the previous right on the part of an applicant to insist on a hearing and replaced that with the local review body, providing them with the power to choose a procedure which more accurately reflects the facts and circumstances of the individual case. And lastly, that guidance issued by the Scottish Government's Chief Planner in 2011 stated that reviews by local review bodies should be conducted by means of full consideration of the application afresh. This review should take the form of a structured discussion led by the chairperson to consider the matter set out in the notice of review before you, and I would conclude by drawing your attention in particular to points 10 to 12 of the procedure note. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Masson. It's just to let you know, due to a conflict of interest, Councillor Bell is here to replace Councillor Mason for the review relating to 25 Westfield Terrace. Therefore, I'm proposing that we take the item first on the agenda to allow Councillor Bell obviously to depart the meeting thereafter. So that's just to let you understand the deviation away from the agenda as we had it printed. Okay, if I can just make sure I've got my notes in the right order. Right, so turning to consideration of the first review, which is now 4.1, in respect of the decision to refuse the application for the erection of a garage extension to the side and front and the associated alterations to the boundary wall and formation of hard surface access driveway, and the formation of 2 windows to the rear of 25 Westfield Terrace, planning reference 191897/BPP. We will hear again from the planning advisor, Mr. Gavin Evans, who will provide us with a brief description of the application proposal and a reminder of the reasons why the application was refused. I would point out that Mr. Evans attends today's meeting to provide us with the necessary professional planning guidance as he has not been involved in the earlier consideration of the application for review. Mr. Evans will, however, not be asked to express any views on the merit of the proposed development. In effect, his role will be a neutral one involving the provision of factual information and guidance. Mr. Evans.
Thank you, Convener. I'll just get the presentation up here for everybody to see. I'll just make that a little bit larger as well. Hopefully everyone can see that now.
Yes, thank you.
And thank you, Chairperson. So yes, the first item we're considering today is a request for review against an application refused under delegated powers for the erection of a garage extension to the side and front of number 25 Westfield Terrace, along with associated alterations to the boundary wall, the formation of hard surface / driveway to the front of the garage, and the formation of 2 windows to the rear of the property. The slides for this presentation, if you're following separately, are on pages 187 to 222 of the agenda pack. So starting just procedurally, the review was found to have been submitted with all the necessary information and within the time limit of 3 months following the decision taken by the appointed officer. The applicant has indicated on the notice of review that new matters have been raised in the review submissions. These new matters, which are discussed in the accompanying review statement, include the assertion that the proposed garage is required to accommodate an electric car and the associated charging infrastructure, and that it's proposed to remove an existing access to the rear of the property if this application is approved. The notice of review explains that these matters were not explicitly covered in the application, but were referred to in informal discussions with the case officer. So in the applicant's view, should be given full consideration as part of the review. It's ultimately for members to decide whether you consider these new matters should be taken into consideration, having had regard for the relevant legal tests. Our legal advisor, Mr. Thompson, can perhaps provide a brief reminder of those tests, and we can come back to the content of the appellant's case later, including those points if accepted. So perhaps just invite Mr. Thompson to say a few words at this point.
Through you, Convener. Yeah, as the local review body will be aware, the legal provisions that govern the local review body prohibits the raising of new matters that weren't before the officer who made the determination originally. However, there are 2 tests that can be applied, and those are if the person can demonstrate that the matter could not have been raised before that time, or that that is not being raised before that time as a consequence of exceptional circumstances. So it's whether the body are convinced that there are exceptional circumstances or a good reason why it wasn't raised before that justify allowing this into consideration.
Thank you, Mr. Thompson. I'll maybe take Councillor Duncan.
I don't see that it couldn't have been raised at the time of the proposal because it's not an emergency to decide to have an electric vehicle, and I don't see there's any exceptional circumstances. So I don't think that, I think the legal provision about no new matters should apply.
Thank you. Councillor Bell.
Thank you, Chair. I really can't see that there are any exceptional circumstances. You know, a charger is a charger. You know, electric car is an electric car. It's not a bus. I don't get it really.
Yeah, okay. So I think we're content that we won't be allowing any extra information following your guidance, Mr. Thompson. Mr. Evans, back to yourself. Oh, you're on mute.
My apologies. Thank you. I'll just get the presentation back up here. There we go. Thank you. So moving on from that, in terms of the procedure by which the review process will be conducted, the applicant has expressed the view that a site visit would be necessary in this case to allow members to appreciate the proposal in its surrounding context. I'll provide some background to members for this case before handing back to you, Chairperson, for members to decide how you wish to proceed in terms of further procedure.
if you've got some of your usual Google Maps stuff, that would be really helpful as well, Mr. Evans.
Sure, yep, I've got that queued up and ready to go. So,
Thank you.
so just flick through these slides first of all, and can always come back to some Street View images. So the application site for this application comprises a detached dwelling house that sits on a corner plot, which is 2 stories at the front and 3 stories at the rear due to a change in ground levels. The building has a pitched slate roof. Sorry, I'll just flick through these as I go. And that's the application site outlined in red, and then an aerial photo just to give you an indication of how things are. So perhaps just talk to this one. So yes, as I was saying, the building has a pitched slate roof and its walls are finished in a wet dash render, which isn't characteristic of the surrounding area. It tends to be more sort of exposed granite. Its principal frontage faces northwest onto a section of Westfield Terrace, which is a dead end to the west. That's just off to the right of this photograph here, abutting rear gardens of properties on Whitehall Terrace. So that's the wall just to the right of the property, which encloses its rear garden. The property has been previously extended with a 1.5-story extension added to the western elevation. That's just this asymmetrical portion of roof that you can see here. The garden grounds to the side and to the rear are enclosed by a granite rubble wall of approximately 2 meters in height, which, as we'll see from later photographs provided by the applicant, has been raised in some sections through the use of brick. With a lower rendered dwarf wall at the front and east side of the property. You can just see that stepping down at the sort of front, and sorry, that's the rear view. I was hoping I had one of the side. I'm afraid I don't. But that lower section of wall continues around the corner onto that section of Westfield Terrace. The photos included in the applicant submission, as I said, show that some sections of the height of the wall have been increased through the use of brick, albeit it appears not the section to be altered for the proposed works. I'll come back to that later on. The higher section of wall to the east of the property frontage is rendered on its street-facing side, as you can see from this image. So it's not exposed granite, it's got a render applied to the front of that. Off-street parking is available to the rear of the property. However, the applicant's statement refers to issues with this due to the presence of on-street parking directly opposite and ground level changes as you join the carriageway, making it unsuitable for vehicles with lower ground clearance. I think there's a potential for scraping the bottom of a vehicle as you come out there. The application is also located, the application site is also located within the Rosemount and WESTBURN conservation area. I'll just flick through these images. So that's the rear elevation, and then this one perhaps shows the sort of dead end part of the street, and this is the wall concerned with the works. In terms of planning history for the site, planning permission was granted in October 2014 for the change of use of the site from a care home to a dwelling house, and for the erection of a garage at the south of the site, essentially the sort of bottom of the garden. The construction of that garage was not implemented, albeit the change of use was. And because that change of use has taken place, the implementation of that overall consent has commenced, meaning that it wouldn't lapse, as would be the case if a consent hadn't been started. So on that basis, members perhaps need to be mindful of the combined effects of that remaining portion of that consent along with what's before us today. Turning to the proposal, these are just some photos that the applicants provided to show the sections of the boundary wall which have obviously been raised through the addition of some extra brick layers on top. It's a little bit unclear exactly where these photos have been taken from, and that's not been detailed extensively, although I would say that this one with the sort of bungalow properties in the background appears to be out with the scope of, sorry if I'm just flicking back here, because it's these properties along here that are the bungalows. It seems most likely that that photo is taken of a bit of wall along here, which is unrelated to the works that are in front of us. So there's perhaps a question about how relevant that is. So just flicking back through, this is a photograph that the case officer had taken of the site, which is looking onto Westfield Terrace, And this is the portion of the wall where the dead end of the street is up here, and the other side, the outside face of this wall is rendered. So you can see certainly that part doesn't appear to have been altered through the use of brick. What we can't tell is whether the return leg that joins up with the building has been altered in that way. That's something that you could potentially look at on a site visit should you consider that to be necessary. So just turning to a description of the proposal, planning permission in this application is sought for the erection of a single-storey pitched roof garage extension to the side of the house. That's just shown in red here on the right-hand image. So this is existing on the left and as proposed on the right, as well as the formation of 2 openings in the rear elevation with the installation of 2 timber-framed sash and case windows. The proposed extension features an asymmetrical roof, meaning that the eaves height is lower to the rear than at the front. That's best seen in sections. If I just flip through here, there you go. So that perhaps shows the asymmetrical slope of the roof that I'm referring to. And sorry to flick around with the slides like this. And the garage extension would project forward of the front wall of the house by approximately 2 meters. That's just this step out that you can see here. The extension incorporates a double garage door in its street frontage and measures approximately 11 meters wide, with walls to be finished in grey dried ash harling and the roof finished in natural slate. In order to accommodate the proposed garage extension, works for the partial removal and partial lowering of the existing boundary wall are also proposed. This affects the wall running along the site boundary abutting the public pavement, so talking about this section here, as well as the section which returns from here to the to adjoin the house itself, which would be lowered in order to accommodate visibility. So that's talking about this section in here. It's perhaps a little bit regrettable it isn't shown as existing on the left-hand plan. So the officer's report refers to a length of approximately 15 meters of the wall being affected in some way, whether downtaken entirely or lowered for the purposes of visibility, with a 7.5 meter wide opening formed. And that's the opening there. Granite downtakings from the existing wall would be used to form a new section of wall, linking the remaining wall at the pavement edge with the garage extension. So that's talking about these 2 sections in here, just connecting everything up. The officer's report also notes that the application was amended from its original submission to pull it further back from the boundary with the public pavement. So this frontage has actually come further back than was previously the case, and thus reduce its projection beyond the front face of the house. But as members will be aware, we're just considering what's before us today rather than any earlier iteration. As a result of its position set back from the pavement, there is an area of hard standing measuring approximately 3 meters long by 7.5 meters wide, which sits in front of the garage door. This is mentioned later in the context of the Council's Roads Development Management Team's response to the application. In terms of the appointed officer's decision, sorry, I'll come back to the reasons for refusal once I've flipped through the images, just to let you familiarise yourself. So this is the street elevation. This gives you an indication of how that would look alongside the existing house. The rear view, which shows the 2 new windows which are being positioned in there. As I mentioned, those are timber sash and case windows of a type that would generally be appropriate in a historic setting. The principle being, or the question being more perhaps whether the formation of new openings is acceptable. The appointed officer's report expressed satisfaction on that front. Side elevation from the east, so you can just see the extension peeking out there, and from the west view, again, that just shows well the asymmetrical roof, albeit the extent to which you would actually see that is negligible, because this is looking from a sort of dead end part of the street and doesn't show that the wall would be in the way. These are just sections through showing the accommodation within. And cross sections of the windows really just included to demonstrate that they are working sash encase frames rather than a sort of look-alike product. Okay. I'll come back to these slides later. They're mentioned elsewhere. In terms of the appointed officer's reasons for refusal, these make reference to the following factors under three main headings. Firstly, design, scale and impact on the conservation area. It's mentioned that the proposal would detract from the historic character of the building and its surroundings, principally resulting from its projection forward of the principal elevation. The excessive width is also noted as unbalancing the symmetry of the elevation, and the materials are not seen as being complementary to the wet dash render of the dwelling. The applicant has in their submission expressed comfort that materials and finishes could be conditioned if members were so minded, and I think they're willing to accommodate on that front. The proposal would result in the loss of a historic granite boundary wall with limited reuse of downtakings being proposed, and it was seen that there was a conflict with policy D5 of local development plan, our granite heritage that's called. Proposal would adversely affect the special character and appearance of the Rosemount and Westburn conservation area, contrary to Scottish planning policy, historic environment policy for Scotland, and policies D1, H1 and D4 of local development plan relating to design, residential areas and historic environment, as well as the equivalent policies in the emerging proposed local development plan. In terms of impact on public safety, this was highlighted. The proportions of the driveway area in front of the garage do not comply with the transport and accessibility supplementary guidance. If parked at right angles to the road, as recommended in that guidance, a car would overhang the footway, and this was seen as being a public safety issue. If parked parallel to the road, then driver visibility would be inadequate. So on either option, this was unsatisfactory from a road's point of view. And then the last heading is excessive off-street parking. So when considered in context with the existing and previously approved car parking serving the site, that was seen as being excessive. The officer noted also the availability of on-street parking as evidenced by the applicant's submission of a parking survey. And lastly, it was noted that there was conflict with the transport and accessibility supplementary guidance as a result of that over provision of car parking or potential over provision. In terms of the appellant's case, this is set out in the notice of review along with an accompanying statement, both of which are in the agenda pack. Just picked out the sort of main central points. So this highlights that the stated reasons for refusal do not refer to the proposed new windows, only the garage extension. So just highlighting that the appointed officer had expressed satisfaction with that element of the proposal. That's backed up by the officer's report as well. Contends that the proposals would in fact comply with the local development plan and its supplementary guidance and are supported by other material considerations, including Scottish planning policy, historic environments policy for Scotland, and the accompanying historic environment Scotland extensions guidance. Also the conservation area character appraisal for the Rosemount and Westburn conservation area, and an earlier planning decision at 4 Westfield Terrace. If I just flick back, a couple of slides, this is the earlier proposal that's being referred to at 4 Westfield Terrace. This was actually for a few split rather than a sort of domestic extension, where the existing plot for this house was being subdivided in this way so that number 4's plot would be reduced and a new property would be constructed in that remaining portion of land. So the point that's being made there in the submission is that this shows another example where a property has been built closer to the road than the existing property. It is perhaps worth noting that number 4 Westfield Terrace fronts onto Westfield Terrace, whereas the new property would front onto Craigie Loanings. So to some extent, it is still behind the original property, and the extent to which there's actually a clear building line along Craigie Loanings is perhaps not the most formal or regimented building line that you would see. So that's ultimately the point that's being made, I think. Sorry, I'll just flick back and you can see the oh yes, sorry, the other point that was being made in the context of raising this this application was the intervention into the boundary wall in order to facilitate access to off-street car parking. That's a 6 metre wide access being formed there for the purposes of the driveway, and then there's a smaller access formed for the sort of footpath to the front door sort of thing. We'll come back to the sort of policy surrounding interventions into granite walls and things shortly. But just going back to the appellant's case, the appellant contends that the proposal would respect the historic character of the conservation area, having regard to the reason behind its designation. So that picks out from the conservation area character appraisal that the main drivers for the designation of the Rosemount and Westburn conservation area were preserving the parkland setting and buildings of the former Cornhill Hospital campus, and the historic street pattern of the surrounding area, and neither of those being affected by the proposal. I think the argument being made is that this doesn't fundamentally alter the key values of the conservation area. Would facilitate the use of an electric vehicle through installation of charging infrastructure. As we mentioned, this is new information that hadn't previously formed part of the proposal, so we wouldn't take that into consideration. Would deliver a net improvement in road safety compared with the current situation. I think the argument there is on the basis that the existing driveway is trickier to navigate as a result of the on-street parking on the opposite side of the road and the dip when joining the carriageway. And also the proposal would use materials appropriate to the building and its setting. As I mentioned before, the appellants have indicated they're happy for conditions to be used to ensure appropriate materials if members are minded that way. Sorry, excuse me. Just moving on to consultations. The local Queen's Crossing Harlaw Community Council provided no response to this application. The council's roads development management team stated its objection, noting that the area between the garage and the pavement should be no more than 1 metre, unless it can achieve the standard 5 or 6 metres driveway length. So the point being made there is that it needs to either accommodate a car or be less than 1 metre, so it's just negligible and wouldn't tempt anybody to try and park a vehicle on it and partially overhanging the footway. The Roads Development Management response also highlights that a parking survey submitted by the applicant demonstrated that the loss of 2 on-street spaces to facilitate the development would be acceptable in this instance. There's no evidence of a particular problem with pressure on on-street parking in the area. Notes also that only 1 footway crossing per property is generally permitted, and therefore the existing driveway to the rear would have to be closed off or removed at the applicant's expense, presumably involving removal of the pavement crossing itself. So that's something that could potentially be conditioned, and the appellants have indicated that would be their intention. There were no representations made in connection with this application. At that point, Chairperson, I would just hand back to you in terms of further procedure.
Thanks very much. Yeah, but before you disappear, I think, could I maybe ask you just to do some Google sort of street images so we can get a kind of a wider view of the area rather than just so before we decide whether we've actually got to go for a site visit?
Yeah, sure, that's no problem. I'll just share my screen here. What I would just flag up is that the images that we would look at on Google Street View aren't necessarily up to date. I will be able to tell you exactly when they're from, but just something worth noting. Can you see that screen okay now?
Yeah, let's see there.
First and foremost, you'll notice the property's a different colour.
Yeah.
So let me just check. This is from May 2014, so some considerable time ago, but So this is the section of lowered wall I was talking about that continues down the side as far as the sort of rear wall of the property, and then that steps back up. If I go down here, you'll be able to see the access for the rear driveway that's towards the bottom of the garden. There we go. And I think because there's a bit of a slope on the road and also a bit of a dip down before the carriageway raises up, I think the appellants are sort of pointing to this as being a potential sort of scrape point for vehicles. Whether that's an insurmountable obstacle is perhaps, you know, undetermined or unclear. So the two new windows are going in at I think it's roughly this level, in line with these. And if I go along the frontage, you can get a better view of the sort of, oh no, that's as far as it goes, I'm afraid. So that's the section of wall, and you can see the dead end. There's no sort of public thoroughfare there really, so the amount of...
Can I see the other side of the road, Gavin? See what's opposite.
Yeah, quite difficult to see through the tree cover, I'm afraid. The properties on the other side of the road, I think there are perhaps 3 or 4 that are actually C-listed from memory, albeit, you know, the potential to affect setting is negligible here.
Yeah. Is that an access across the road?
Looks to be a driveway there, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. And then that's a dead end. Is there any other pictures either Councillor Duncan or Councillor Bell want while he's got Google Maps or Streets, whatever it's called, up? No? You're okay, Councillor Duncan. You okay, Councillor Bell?
Yes, yeah, I'm good.
Okay, that's fine. Thanks, Gavin.
No problem.
Members, obviously we've heard from the applicant that they have suggested that we may need a site visit. Councillor Duncan.
No, I'm happy with the photographs and the Google Street View to see the
Okay.
setting.
Councillor Bell?
Yeah, similarly, I'm quite happy with the information that we currently have.
Yeah, and again, I would agree that we have sufficient information to make a decision today. I think the extra street maps and Google Maps, whatever you want to call them, have given us the insight that we need, even if they are a few years out of date. Mr. Evans, can I hand back to you?
Of course, thank you, Chairperson. So just moving on to the policy side of things, I'll make sure to share my screen here. There we go. So yes, moving on to the policy side of things, the application site falls within an area which is zoned as a residential area in the local development plan, where policy H1 applies. Policy H1 sets out a series of criteria for new development to meet, stating that proposals for new development will be acceptable in principle if they firstly do not constitute overdevelopment. In this case, we're talking about a domestic extension to a residential property, so there's no intensification in terms of the number of planning units or a number of homes. Secondly, this should not have an unacceptable impact on the character and amenity of the surrounding area, and that's where members will be required to sort of exercise their judgment on what you feel the character of the area is at present and the extent to which it would be altered and affected either positively or negatively as a result of this proposal. Thirdly, proposals should not result in the loss of valuable and valued areas of open space. Again, because this is within the context of a domestic curtilage, there's no public open space affected. And lastly, proposals should comply with relevant supplementary guidance to the local development plan. In this case, relevant documents would be the Householder Development Guide, which has content on domestic alterations generally, the Windows and Doors supplementary guidance, and also the Transport and Accessibility supplementary guidance, which has commentary on driveways and accesses to domestic properties. I'll come back to those shortly. Policy D1 applies to all developments and is ultimately about design quality. Requires development to be of a high standard of design, which demonstrates an understanding of its context, and links to 6 essential qualities of good placemaking. Those being development should be distinctive, should be welcoming, safe and pleasant, easy to move around, adaptable, and resource efficient. Policy D4 relating to the historic environment is relevant because the application site lies within a conservation area. This states that the City Council will protect, preserve and enhance the historic environment in line with national and local policy and guidance. Also offers support for high quality design which respects the character, appearance and setting of the historic environment and which protects the special architectural and historic interest of conservation areas. Excuse me. Next is policy D5, which relates to our granite heritage. This encourages the retention and reuse of granite buildings and features, including boundary walls. Partial demolition, it states that partial demolition will not be granted consent unless the planning authority is satisfied that it meets the relevant Historic Environment Scotland tests. I think it's worth mentioning at this point that interventions of the scale proposed here would generally just be treated as an alteration rather than a demolition, because, you know, in large part the wall is being retained. So those tests generally wouldn't be applied. Where retention isn't viable, then visible reuse as a building material would be required. The distinction there being not crushed up and used as hardcore or something along those lines. You know, it should be facing walls or used in hard landscaping, something along those lines. Coming back to supplementary guidance, the Householder Development Guide sets out some general principles for extensions, stating that proposals should be architecturally compatible in design and scale with the original house and the surrounding area. Extensions should not dominate or overwhelm the original house, with extensions remaining visually subservient. No extension should result in a situation where amenity of neighbouring properties would be adversely affected in terms of privacy, daylight and general amenity. And earlier developments approved prior to this guidance was introduced will not be accepted as justification in support of proposals that otherwise fail to comply with those criteria. The footprint of the dwelling as extended, sorry, just flick over to the next slide, as extended should not exceed twice that of the original house. The officer's report in this case indicates that the extended property would be 141% of the original. So that's taking account of this extension and the earlier one. So the footprint is not doubled ultimately. No more than 50% of the front or rear curtilage may be covered by development. That doesn't necessarily mean that anything less is acceptable. It's still to be determined on its merits, but the report does confirm that less than 50% of the curtilage would be developed, and that much is clear just from looking at the site plan. You know, it's quite a large corner plot. The maximum permitted size of a single-storey extension to a detached property will be determined on a case-by-case basis, so there's no set dimension, perhaps reflecting that on a detached property there's reduced scope for impacting neighbours directly through loss of light to windows and things like that. So turning on to the Council's windows and doors supplementary guidance, it's referring to the repair and replacement of. Paragraph 4.8 refers to new openings, new window and door openings, and talks about these having to be carefully located to avoid disruption to the characteristics of the surrounding external and internal context. Where the building forms part of a larger grouping, it may be necessary to consider the wider impact. There's a table at part 4, which I've provided a sort of screenshot of here, indicating that new window openings generally are not permissible on listed buildings and on the public elevation of unlisted buildings in a conservation area. So mentioned before, this property is not listed, it is in a conservation area, but the new windows will be installed on the rear or non-public elevation, so there's no inherent conflict with the supplementary guidance on that front. Oh, I'm afraid I must have missed a slide on the transport and accessibility guidance, but I've got some content anyway. The Transport and Accessibility SG states that conversion of front gardens for car parking will only be permitted where rear garden parking is not an option, where there are no implications for road safety, and where on-street parking is not readily available in the vicinity. In this case, as we've seen, rear garden parking does exist and has also been consented, which remains live, and the site is in an area which is not covered by a controlled parking zone, so there is a degree of on-street parking available. In general, only one footway crossing per property is permitted. In some situations, this may be relaxed. Where properties have suitable existing facilities to the rear, it is unlikely that permission will be granted for further crossings at the front of the building. So as we heard before, rear parking already exists and there is consent in place for a garage to the rear, though the appellants have indicated that they would be willing for that rear access to be closed off in the event of approval, meaning that there would only be one footway crossing. Parking will not be granted where the property has a rear garden area suitable for parking, which is accessible from a rear lane or side street. Again, we've heard that there's access from the side street and there's existing parking. Driveways in existing houses must be at least 5 meters in length. The area of hard standing which is in front of the garage, whether it's intended for use as a driveway or not, could be used for that purpose and is only 3 meters in length, so there is conflict with that criteria. And the driveway should meet the public road at right angles, and a vehicle should be able to enter and exit the driveway at right angles to the road so that a driver can see clearly in both directions without having to turn around excessively. So as I mentioned before, if the vehicle was parked on the hard standing diagonally or sort of side on to the road, then that would fail to comply on the basis of inadequate visibility. So turning to Scottish planning policy, this is relevant in the context of the historic environment, stating that proposals in conservation areas should preserve or enhance the character and appearance of a conservation area. However, proposals that do not harm the character or appearance should be treated as preserving it. Historic Environment Scotland's publication in relation to extensions from its Managing Change series is also relevant. A few key points picked out. Firstly, proposals must protect the character and appearance of the building. They should be subordinate in scale and in form. Should be located generally on a secondary elevation and must be designed in a high quality manner using appropriate materials. Extensions that would unbalance a symmetrical elevation and threaten the original design concept should be avoided. Where an extension is built beside a principal elevation, it should generally be lower than and set back behind that facade. Those last 2 points are things that were picked out in the appointed officer's report. The symmetry of the property being unbalanced through this extension to the side and the stepping forward of the garage from the front wall of the house. Next is the Rosemount and Westburn Conservation Area Character Appraisal. This highlights that Westburn Terrace lies within Character Area A, which is the streets to the south of Rosemount Place. Properties on the northern side of Westfield Terrace are Category C listed and identified as making a strong contribution to Character Area A. Identified negative factors for this character area include the use of lesser quality materials and the design used in developments from the sort of 1980s and 1990s. The house at 25 Westfield Terrace is specifically mentioned as being, and just quoting here, very different from all the others in this character area. A large, elevated, detached property on the corner plot and painted white. We've seen that that's now grey. There are very few trees in its surrounds, making it stand out further. So as much as the property isn't picked out as being of the greatest value of those in the conservation area, it is noted as being particularly sort of stand out in other ways. It also notes that it had recently been renovated to a house having previously been a residential home. The applicant cites the main reasons for the designation of the conservation area in support of the proposal, contending that the proposal doesn't conflict with the preservation of the historic street pattern and the grant buildings within it. It's for members to come to your own judgment on the appropriateness of the extension in terms of its context. So, just last points for consideration. Members to have regard to the development plan and to any other material considerations you feel are relevant to the application that would point to either overturning the original decision or dismissing the review. main key points to consider. Firstly, the zoning. Does the proposal satisfy the tests of policy H1 relating to residential areas? Would it have an unacceptable impact on the character and amenity of the area? Secondly, does it comply with the relevant supplementary guidance from the householder guide regarding the extension, from the windows and doors guidance regarding the new openings, and from transport accessibility regarding driveway siting and dimensions, provision of a second means of footway crossing, etc. Is design quality sufficiently high to satisfy policy D1? Would the proposal preserve or enhance the character and appearance of the conservation area as required by the relevant national guidance and policy D4 of local development plan? And also, would it comply with policy D5 in relation to downtakings and the reuse of granite? Ultimately coming to the conclusion on whether you feel it complies with the development plan as a whole, and what other considerations, what other material considerations are there, and do these weigh in favour of approval or refusal? Happy to assist with any questions or if conditions are required. And at that point, I'll just hand back to you there, Chairperson.
Thanks very much, Gavin. Obviously, members, if we've got questions, I'll start again with yourself, Councillor Duncan. Have you got questions for Mr. Evans? Sorry, I can't hear you, Sarah. Can you speak up a little bit?
Sorry, no, I don't have any questions, no.
Okay, Councillor Bell, have you got questions for Mr. Evans?
Yes, just one question. So the granite downtakings, how much of those will be reused? Or supposed to be reused?
I'm afraid I couldn't put an exact volume on that, Councillor Bell. What I could do is perhaps just go back to that plan and indicate the lengths that we're talking about. So the officer's report referred to the opening being, is it 11.5 meters wide? Yeah, so it refers to a section of wall of 15 meters wide being affected. So that would involve making the opening itself and then also the lowering that would take place at sections along here to allow for visibility. The reuse, I think, would be in, not sure if I can zoom in on that plan. Sorry, I was trying to zoom in on the plan and failing miserably there.
Are you sharing with us, Gavin, or are you just looking at it yourself?
Oh, my apologies. I
wasn't sure if you were doing a calculation yourself.
No, just completely forgetting that you couldn't see what I could see. Seems to be something that I do. There we go. That's what I was trying to do and failing to do. So that's not terribly clear, I'm afraid, but the extent of the reuse, I think, would be largely informing these lowered sections in here. So whether you think that's sufficient or I suppose the problem would be that if you were to use more of it, then the wall is potentially higher than would allow for adequate visibility from the access. So the question then becomes, well, where else do you reuse it?
Yeah, so it's quite minimal then, really.
Yeah. I think there would certainly be some surplus left over afterwards, by the sounds of it.
Yeah.
Any questions?
No, that was really all I was to ask.
Mr. Evans, could I get you to bring up a photograph again of the actual photograph of the front of the house where the garage would be next to?
Yep, sure.
Thanks.
Right, remember to share this time. Sorry. Wrong screen. Try that again. We've got one there which doesn't really show too much of the property, it more just shows the wall. And then if I flick back, that one shows it in the context of the house a bit better. So it's unfortunate that the outer face of the wall's been rendered. It maybe doesn't look as great. as it otherwise would. The internal face is much more sort of appealing and shows off the historic character.
Okay, that's fine. Sorry, Councillor Duncan, I noticed you've got your hand up.
No, it was just to try and be helpful, actually. On page 228 of the pack, it does say that there's going to be 18 square meters lost from the wall.
Ah, that's helpful.
So they're going to remove a 14-meter length of the 2-meter high wall, and there's going to be a 7.5-meter wide gap. So they're going to 7 cubic meters. I'm sure Philip will understand what that means. I don't really.
Oh, with you, Sarah.
Quite a big
It's
number.
going to be removed. So it is a significant amount of the boundary wall is going to be removed, and I can't see that building the kind of dwarf wall out a bit is going to use very much of it at all.
And for just posing a thought, if members did consider it, suitable to do so, could that, obviously you mentioned something, Gavin, about being able to condition the closure of the access on the other side of the building, which is got the big red gate, I think it had. And given it's a same sort of wall, could that be conditioned that they do use it there, or would that not be a decided?
Yeah, I think that's something that you might well be able to capture with conditions, perhaps the first requiring submission of a scheme for the closure of that existing opening, and then the second requiring a scheme to be agreed prior to works commencing in terms of the reuse of downtakings, and you can make clear that it was expected that that material would be used there where practicable. Okay.
All right, thank you. Any more questions for Mr. Evans? No?
Okay. Yes, sorry, Camina. So if you conditioned the reuse of the granite, for instance, and you make other conditions, how do you actually ensure they are carried out? An inspector will go and visit and sign it off, though?
Generally speaking, a submission would be obtained, and then the planning authority would write out to confirm its acceptance or otherwise. And then once that had been accepted, the implementation it's really just left to the applicant to comply. And until such time as it's brought to our attention that there's a breach, at which point we would send out an enforcement inspector. We don't have the resources to actively visit each and every site to ensure compliance with conditions, so we are very much reliant on reports from members of the public.
Thank you.
Okay, members, if there's no more questions for Mr. Evans, in accordance with the procedure notes circulated, the local review body will now discuss and decide. We've already decided the manner the review will proceed, which is online here today. I would highlight that all representations relating to the case have been considered and taken into account. So perhaps if I start with yourself, Councillor Duncan, or will I make Councillor Bell go first? Councillor Bell, let's have you alphabetical.
All right, thank you. So Camina, I can see that the building, symmetry of the building will be unbalanced. I can see it's in conflict with the conservation area. The Aberdeen City Council policy is to enhance the area, but I don't see that this does enhance it. I can't see that having a battery charger actually changes the reasons for refusal. I mean, these things are quite small. You can fit them on a lamppost. So I really can't see there's any good reason for actually overturning officer's decision.
Councillor Duncan.
I agree that I can't see compelling reasons to overturn the officer's decision. For me, the critical factor is that the Scottish Government transport guidance isn't being complied with, and that it says very clearly that front garden parking is not allowed where there's possibility of back garden parking, and where there's sufficient on-street parking, and both of those things are the case here. And there is indeed an entrance at the back at the moment. The fact that it might not exactly meet the applicant's requirements surely that could be remedied. So I don't like the fact that it projects 2 meters in front of the existing building, and I think that's particularly relevant in a conservation area. Although that objection is kind of reduced a bit because of the location of this particular building. It's at a cul-de-sac, and there doesn't seem to be any direct overlooking from the houses opposite because of all the tree cover, although we did see photographs that were 6 years old from that. But I still think the principle of a 2-meter projection is a lot. It's not marginal. So I think it, like Councillor Bell, I think it would upset the symmetry of the building, and it might dominate, and it would be a modern extension. So I cannot see reasons to overturn this decision here.
Okay. Thank you, Councillor Duncan. For me, this one has got merits and it's got disadvantages. I think primarily for me, the biggest sort of sticking point is the fact the overhanging of the pavement and the building projecting 2 meters forward. If it was 2 meters further back, giving the necessary space for a car to make it a driveway is kind of one thing nor the other. So for me, that's my biggest contention. The fact it's down a dead end, I think, is in its favour, because you don't have football passing it. Actually, I think it could benefit the area if we could close up the other access, because I think you get a lot more footfall that way, and obviously a lot more cars passing. So from a safety point of view, I think it would be actually a preferred access point, but I think it would have to comply with that additional 2 meters required. I think 5 meters, Evans, you said, was required, and it's only got 3. So as you say, Councillor Duncan, it's not marginal. It's not just a little squeak of a difference. It is quite significant. For me, if that had been overcome, I would have been comfortable, because actually, if you look at the house, because of the rendering, it's actually very difficult to date. Because I thought, oh my God, who put that brand new house in the corner when I first looked at it on the photograph? But I think, I think the reason I would have gone with it would have been because of where it was located down this dead end. But I think I can't get beyond the 2 meter shortfall that's required to create a drive. And again, I would have been asking for a condition to close up the other driveway, and for the taking downs to be used part of the building up of the wall as they closed it off. So, I think there's opportunities for this to be adapted, but I think at the moment, the way it sits, it just goes too far out with guidance in terms of P2 for me to be comfortable. So I think you have a unanimous decision there, Mr. Evans, that we're all upholding the officer's recommendation. Members, can I just ask, obviously the applicant may or may not wish to come back. Now, I've expressed certain views which were for my views in terms of things to be done to adapt, make it acceptable. Obviously, if the applicant comes in and this can be then reverted back to any officer, would you feel similarly, or do you feel that it's not something that you'd want to support in terms of?
I think I agree with you, Councillor Bolton, that the fact that it's on a dead end and there's not very much pedestrian traffic passing, where the current entrance is on a road that's used a lot. And if we could condition using the down takings to fill in the old gap, that would be fine. But it also does need to sit at the same projection as the existing building. It's just too big. Garage is just too big. And they need to look at that if they want to try again. Yeah.
Councillor Bell, are you happy? It's just that Mr. Evans will obviously note this and feed it back as part of our consideration.
Yes, yeah. So I think that sounds very sensible.
Okay. All right, Mr. Masson, do you just want to do an official vote just so that we've got it for the record?
Yeah, sorry. Yes, that was clear that that was a unanimous decision taken by the 3 members to uphold the officer's decision to refuse the application.
Okay, with that addition, and Mr. Evans, you're comfortable with the information we've given you that could be used of a subsequent application?
Yes, thank you, convener. I'll add that to the appointed officer's reasons for refusal in terms of what needs to be addressed in a subsequent application should they choose to make one.
Okay, that's super. Thank you very much. Okay, Councillor Bell, are you going and Councillor Masson's coming on? Mason?
Well, I need to go. I've got
Yeah.
30 seconds to my next meeting. Yes.
Well, appreciate you stepping in at short notice. Thank you, and welcome, Councillor Mason.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, Mr. Masson. Do you want to just confirm Mr. Mason's here?
Yeah, Councillor Mason has just joined the meeting to consider the following two applications. Councillor, and just to confirm that Councillor Bell has now left the meeting.
Yes, thank you very much, Mr. Mason. Gosh, Mason and Masson, I'm going to have fun here today. Okay, now turning to the second review in respect of the decision to refuse the application for the change of use from amenity land to garden ground at 34 Seaview Place. Planning reference 200162/DPP. We'll now hear from the planning advisor in attendance, Mr. Gavin Evans, who will provide us with a brief of the application proposal and a reminder of the reasons why the application was refused. I would point out that Mr. Evans attends today's meeting to provide us with necessary professional planning guidance because he has not been involved in the earlier consideration of the application under review. Mr. Evans, however, will not be asked to express any view on the merits of the proposed development, and in effect his role will be a neutral one, providing with the provision of factual information and guidance only. Mr. Evans.
Thank you, convener. I'll just share my screen and the presentation with you again here. Right, there we go. Hopefully everyone can see that now. So yes, the second case before us today relates to an application for review against the appointed officer's earlier refusal under delegated powers for the change of use from amenity land to garden ground at 34 Seaview Place, Aberdeen. The presentation for this case is at pages 7 to 24 of the agenda pack. Again, the review has been found to have been submitted with all necessary information and within the time limit of 3 months following the appointed officer's decision. In terms of new information, the submitted notice of review states that the applicant has raised no new matters which weren't before the appointed officer at the time of the earlier decision. Just moving on to a location plan here. A point I need to cover initially, Chairperson, is need to make members aware of a discrepancy in the submissions that may have some bearing on the local review body's consideration of this case. The application site for any planning application is by convention denoted by a red line drawn around the area where planning permission is sought, whilst any other land under the control of the applicant may be outlined in blue. In this case, the plans that were originally submitted indicated the applicant's house and garden enclosed by a blue line, with the area of open space adjacent to the property and subject of the application outlined in red. Sometime later, a revised plan was submitted by the applicant's agent, which swapped those around so that the red line was now enclosing the house and garden, with the area of adjoining open space shown in blue, as you can see from this image on screen. The effect of this is really that there's a discrepancy between the description of the proposal and the submitted site plan, such that permission, if permission had been granted by the appointed officer, or indeed if the local review body today opted to reverse the appointed officer's decision to refuse, the applicant would still technically not have planning permission for the change of use on this bit of ground next to the house. As members are aware, the local review body does have powers to request further information in certain circumstances, but ultimately must consider the same proposal that was considered by the appointed officer in its earlier decision. So that power to accept, power to request additional information, it's really for members to consider whether they feel that seeking a corrected plan would fall within those powers, or whether that would actually alter the nature of the proposal and differ too far from what was considered by the appointed officer. So I don't know if we open that point up for discussion, or if you'd like me just to proceed.
I'll maybe just ask Mr. Thompson for advice, because obviously I think we're in a little bit of a hide into nothing here right now. Mr. Thompson.
Yes, convener. Yeah, this is a bit of an odd discrepancy, I suppose. I mean, I guess it's kind of clear what the intention was. So really, it is a matter for the body to decide whether they would like to ask for an updated plan. I believe so. I believe Mr. Evans can confirm this, that a plan was submitted originally that was correct, and then somehow another plan's been submitted that is incorrect. I don't think it'd be unreasonable to request for an updated plan. In fact, yeah, it's up to the local review body, but I think it'd be reasonable to do that.
Members, I would obviously recommend we ask for an updated plan. And I just confirm with you, Mr. Evans, so when the officer before him had the original one, he had it the right way around?
That's right, and that's ultimately why the application was made valid and accepted. And then when this subsequent plan came in, it's obviously not been noticed that it's flipped them around, and so it's sort of, to some extent, painted the local review body into a bit of a corner. Yeah. So whether we need to formally request further information, given that we actually have that plan already, or whether we can just make a decision that will proceed on the basis of that corrected plan, I'm not sure.
Mr. Thompson, I just obviously I don't want to have the local review body make a decision that could be challenged. So, you know, I think perhaps just to make it abundantly clear and for, you know, that we should perhaps request, you know, that additional, or the correct, call it what you like, map, just so that it's all, you know, legally set out properly. Would you think that makes it correct?
Yes, Convener. Yes, Convener, I think for the purposes of a valid document trail, it would be worthwhile just getting that updated plan. If the body is minded to overturn the original decision, I think it just belt and braces. It just gives them reassurance that we're all speaking about the correct bit of land.
Yeah. Members, would you be more comfortable to do that? Councillor Duncan?
So, yes, I would, yeah.
Okay. Councillor Mason?
Yeah, agree with that.
Okay, so the agreement is that we'll ask for additional information with an updated plan that reflects the proper area to be considered. Is that sufficient wording for you, Mr. Mason? Mark?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay. All right, so thank you, members. So we'll pause this review for now, work it, and we'll move on to the third review which we have. I'm just getting to that. Okay, so I'll give you all a minute. So we're now turning to the consideration of the third review in respect of the decision to refuse the application for the formation of a car parking with access barrier, including change of use and associated works of land for the International Gate DICE planning reference number 191456/DPP. We'll now hear from the planning advisor, Mr. Gavin Evans, who will provide us with a brief description of the application proposal and a reminder of the reasons why the application was refused. I would again point out that Mr. Evans attends today's meeting to provide us with the necessary professional planning guidance because he has not been involved in early consideration of the application and review. Mr. Evans, however, will not be asked to express any views on the merits of the proposed development, and in effect his role will be neutral, involving the provision of factual information and guidance only. Mr. Evans.
Thank you, Convener. I'll just get this third presentation up. So yes, this third case, the slides for this presentation are at pages 65 through to 84 of the agenda pack, and application 191456/DPP related to a refusal under delegated powers for detailed planning permission for the formation of car parking with access barrier, including change of use and associated works on land at International Gate, DICE, Aberdeen. Again, the review was found to have been submitted with all the necessary information and within the time period of 3 months following the appointed officer's decision. No new matters have been raised in this case, and in terms of procedure, the appellants have indicated that a site inspection has been sought to allow members to understand the surrounding context and the site's proximity to the airport. So we'll come back to that point shortly. In terms of a description of the site, this application relates to an undeveloped plot within the ABZ Business Park. It extends to just over 1.5 hectares and comprises rough ground with scrub vegetation. It's located at the northern end of the business park to the east of the Crown Plaza and Holiday Inn hotels, Holiday Inn Express hotels, with the road known as International Gate separating the site and the hotels. So that's International Gate just running down here. To the north, beyond an area of vacant ground out with the business park, is Aberdeen International Airport. The terminal building is approximately 120 metres away to the north as the crow flies, albeit that's not the route by which you can access it. To this, yeah, you might get arrested. To the south and east are further vacant plots within the business park. We'll just flip through these images. That one's a little bit closer in so you can see that more clearly. That's just from the council's GIS mapping system, and then an aerial photo perhaps shows it best. In terms of planning history, the initial planning permission for the development of the ABZ Business Park was granted in 2011. The officer's report details that subsequent applications have allowed for the construction of roads and services infrastructure, and over several years 15 industrial, warehouse, office, hotel and restaurant buildings as well. A valid permission in principle still applies to the business park. In terms of the proposal, so that's just the existing site plan, effectively a red line round an undeveloped field, which benefits from road access via International Gate and that junction. Proposed plan. Detailed planning permissions sought for the construction of a 462 space car park. The majority of the internal road and parking spaces would be finished with a gravel surface, which is grey on the site plan here, with the more heavily used portions at the site access and circulation loop, indicated by the blue dash, being formed of a more heavy-duty conventional road construction. Access and egress would be via a new junction onto the turning circle at the northern end of International Gate, so just coming off here, with a raising arm barrier installed to control access. Of those spaces, 439 spaces would be standard parking spaces, with 23 identified for disabled users. A landscape buffer strip would be provided around the perimeter of the site and in the section dividing the two main parking areas, so just here. Albeit there's no specific detail of exactly how those areas would be planted, so in the event that members were minded to approve, you might wish to obtain further details of that landscaping. The officer's report highlights that the applicant has previously advised that the car park would be made available to a range of users, although latterly discussions narrowed in on it being aimed at airport passengers. The applicant has said that they would accept a condition restricting the use of the car park to airport passengers should the local review body be minded to approve. In terms of site drainage, surface water drainage from car parking areas would be drained through the porous hardcore/gravel surface and then dispersed to the ground within the site. Surface water runoff from the more heavy-duty surface of the access road and turning area would be shed onto those grey areas, and again just dispersed to the ground level below. The applicants have suggested that a method statement for surface water drainage during the construction phase could be provided prior to commencement of works, and again that's something that might be secured by condition should members be minded. That's just a lighting layout plan as well, showing the indication of the columns and the specification of those to provide even coverage. Excuse me. In terms of the appointed officer's decision, the reasons for refusal are stated in full in the decision notice within the agenda pack. Main points to pick out are firstly, the initial proposal was for a car park that would be available for use by a range of users unrelated to any new development. So effectively it's a standalone car park. Such a proposal was seen as being in clear conflict with the Transport and Accessibility Supplementary Guidance, and therefore in that regard the proposal would not be acceptable in principle. The proposal has also been considered on the basis of it potentially being for airport users, based on those comments from the applicant. However, it is considered that was considered by the appointed officer that the provision of additional car parking capacity near the airport would hinder the ability to encourage modal shift towards the use of public transport and sustainable travel. It's stated in the appointed officer's reasons that there's no evidence that there are capacity issues with the existing level of parking available to those using the airport, and additional supply is likely to make driving to and parking at the airport a more attractive proposition. That in turn would be inconsistent with the aims of Scottish planning policy and the regional transport strategy, local transport strategy and policies T2, managing the transport impact of development, and T3, sustainable and active travel of the Aberdeen Local Development Plan. The appellant has submitted a statement in support of the application for local review, which again is available within the agenda pack. This extends to 25 pages plus appendices, which members have had the means to review. The main points picked out from that are main justification is that the proposal would address a qualitative and quantitative deficiency in parking serving the airport, and by doing so it would support the airport's role as a strategic transport hub vital to the regional economy. The proposal would offer greater convenience for passengers who can park and walk the approximate 500-metre distance to the airport rather than being reliant on shuttle buses, as I believe is the case with other long-stay car parks. The proposal would double the number of electric vehicle charging points at Aberdeen Airport. It's noted that there are 12 being proposed. I don't believe the number of electric vehicle spaces was mentioned until later on in the process, but nevertheless, the airport only currently has 6 electric vehicle charging spaces, and the appellants indicate that all 6 of those are for short stay use, so they're no long stay spaces. Highlights support from Dyson Stonywood Community Council, and notes that the provision of improved long stay parking would reduce dependence on unsustainable drop-off traffic and taxi journeys. I think the idea being that a drop-off or a taxi is a two-way journey, whereas if you're just taking your car, you're dropping it off there and then getting it when you return. Argues also that the City Council has produced no evidence that restricting car parking at the airport would encourage public transport use. Points also to Aberdeen Air Park's closure, which removed 750 spaces, as well as the temporary loss of 530 spaces at the park and depart site, whilst it's being used as a COVID-19 testing site by the UK government. The proposal would also allow for the development of a vacant site in which there's been no interest despite marketing. Members perhaps just want to consider with that, planning permission's obviously been granted for business and industrial and related uses. The fact that it hasn't been immediately developed doesn't necessarily mean that the land wouldn't be there to meet future needs. Is there necessarily a pressing need for it to be developed for some other purpose? Is maybe something to apply yourselves to. The proposal in the appellant's view is consistent with the local development plan business and industrial zoning and earlier consents for commercial/development use. The applicants are willing to, as I mentioned before, accept a condition which would control the use as being specific to long stay airport parking. In terms of consultation, copies are included in the agenda pack, but Aberdeen International Airport has no objection to the proposal, stating that the proposed development had been examined from a safeguarding perspective and could conflict with safeguarding criteria unless any planning permission subject to a condition requiring the submission of a bird hazard management plan and implementation thereafter. So again, that's another potential condition, should members be minded to approve. The Council's Roads Development Management team objected to the proposal, stating that the site is located in the outer city and not within any area of controlled parking. After discussing with the Council's Transport Strategy team and Nestrans, the Regional Transport Partnership, the collective opinion is that the proposal would be contrary to the policies aimed at reducing private vehicular trips and undermine the viability of alternative transport modes. There are current targets in the Regional Transport Strategy 2019 monitoring report to increase the proportion of passengers accessing Aberdeen International Airport by public transport to 15% by 2021, and the proposal would harm the potential for achieving that aspiration. Additionally, although the applicant has provided a supporting statement, beyond referencing a need for airport-related parking, it was seen that there was no actual evidence or sufficient justification to corroborate that claim. Construction of the access junction would require to be designed to Aberdeen City Council standards, so the roads construction consent process would apply there separately, and it was noted that the site will remain or shall retain private drainage arrangements, which was seen as being acceptable. The local Dyson Stonywood Community Council expressed support for the proposal. The Community Council agreed that the proposed car parking is consistent with policy B4 relating to Aberdeen Airport, and that it does not diverge unacceptably from policy B1 relating to business and industrial land, given the lack of demand thus far and the oversupply of industrial and commercial space. Notwithstanding that broad support, the Community Council are not altogether convinced that the car park would be a sustainable travel option, although it would be convenient for users being within walking distance of the airport. In terms of representations, there were no public representations made in relation to this application. At that point, Chairperson, I would just hand back to you for members to decide if you consider a site visit or any other procedure necessary. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Evans. Councillor Duncan, are you content that you've got sufficient information to proceed today?
Yes, I am.
Councillor Mason?
Yeah, I'm okay.
Yeah, I am equally. Mr. Evans, back to you. That was quick.
Thank you. Sorry, caught me on the hop there.
Sorry.
Just get this back up. There we go. So policy B1, the application site is located in an area which is zoned as B1 business and industrial land. The main points to pull out from that policy are, firstly, that this land should be retained for uses in classes 4, 5 and 6, those being business, general industrial and storage and distribution, and safeguarded from other conflicting development types. I suppose the key word there being conflicting development types, whether you see that there's an inherent conflict here. Other uses which are suited to a business and industrial location, such as car showrooms and bus depots, for example, shall be treated on their own merits. So there's a question there of whether you feel like this would fall into that category. Facilities also that directly support business and industrial uses may be permitted where they enhance the attraction and sustainability of the city's business and industrial land. So would a car park in this location for the airport make any difference to the appeal of the wider ABZ business park? Such facilities should be aimed primarily at meeting the needs of businesses and employees within the business and industrial area. Lastly, proposals should make provision for amenity open space, strategic landscaping, footpaths, etc. in accordance with the City Council's supplementary guidance. Moving on there. Policy B4 relates to Aberdeen Airport and how development will be assessed in that area. There's an airport safeguarding map which requires consultation with Aberdeen Airport safeguarding team based on the location and nature of development. Proposed developments ultimately must not compromise the safe operation of the airport, and matters such as height of buildings, external lighting, landscaping, bird hazard management and impact on communications or navigations equipment would be taken into account in assessing that safeguarding. The consultation response, as I mentioned before, from the Aberdeen Airport safeguarding team stated no objection, subject to a condition being applied to any consent requiring approval and implementation of a bird hazard management plan, just in order that there's no conflict between bird movement and aircraft movements. Moving on, policy NE6 relates to flooding, drainage and water quality. I won't go through that in detail because it's quite lengthy, but the general theme is that development won't be permitted if it increases the risk of flooding either within the site or elsewhere. The appointed officer's report raises no concerns in terms of this site or the site being at risk of flooding or causing or worsening flooding elsewhere. The drainage arrangements were noted by the Roads Development Management team as being acceptable as a private arrangement, and it was noted also the submissions refer to the majority of the parking space construction as being of porous materials, allowing for water to permeate through and drain into the ground beneath. Policy T2 relating to managing the transport impact of development. It's quite high level, but it does state that new developments would be required to demonstrate that sufficient measures have been taken to minimise traffic generated and to maximise opportunities for sustainable and active travel. So there's perhaps a question there about whether this might encourage travel by private car. Also sets out requirements for transport assessment if thresholds are exceeded. It's not directly relevant in this case, and points to the Transport and Accessibility Supplementary Guidance for further commentary. Policy T3 on sustainable and active travel places an emphasis on encouraging active and sustainable travel, for example, walking, cycling and public transport. Emphasises the need to protect existing links and form new ones where possible by way of sort of footpaths and cycle paths and things. And also notes the scope to encourage car sharing and low emissions vehicles with associated infrastructure. Policy D1 relates to design quality. It's notable in this case that there are no buildings proposed, it's simply the formation of hard surfaces for parking. But then there is a question of whether that formation of a large area of hard surface is appropriate to the context of the business and industrial area, and whether its visual impact might be mitigated to some extent through appropriate landscape planting and sort of buffers and screening around the edges of the site. Turning to the Council's Transport and Accessibility Supplementary Guidance, paragraph 5.1, this mentions that adequate parking can maintain and improve the economic vitality of town centres, enhance the attractiveness of an area for development, and is required to prevent overspill parking into surrounding areas. The over-provision of parking spaces can, however, be a wasteful use of land, lead to increased land prices, reduce building densities, and increased distances people must walk between adjacent land uses. Also notes that over-provision of car parking can reduce travel by alternative forms of transport through the promotion of car use, resulting in a worsening of congestion and air quality problems. States further that there will be a presumption against the creation of freestanding publicly accessible car parks, aside from those required for office, residential or park and ride use, especially in city centre locations, as this would undermine efforts to encourage the use of alternative forms of transport. Over and above these development plan considerations, the commentary in Scottish planning policy is also a material consideration. This states general support for promoting business and industrial development which increases economic activity while safeguarding and enhancing the natural and built environments as national assets. In relation to promoting sustainable transport and active travel, SPP sets out the following policy principles with the aim of the planning system, aim being for the planning system to support patterns of development which optimise the use of existing infrastructure, reduce the need to travel, provide safe and convenient opportunities for walking and cycling for both active travel and recreation, and facilitate travel by public transport. Enable the integration of public transport modes and facilitate freight movement by rail or water. Paragraph 271 development mentions that development plans and development management decisions should take account of the implications and development proposals on traffic, patterns of travel and road safety. Paragraph 279, significant travel generating uses should be sited at locations which are well served by public transport, subject to parking restraint policies, and supported by measures to promote the availability of high quality public transport services. Lastly, at 284, planning authorities, airport operators and other stakeholders should work together to prepare airport master plans and address other planning and transport issues relating to airports. Relevant issues include public safety zone safeguarding, surface transport access to supplies, air freight, staff and passengers, and related on and off-site developments such as transport interchanges, offices, hotels and car parks. Moving on, The regional transport strategy for Aberdeen City and Shire recognises the importance of improving surface connections between Aberdeen Airport and the key economic centres across the city and Shire as the airport develops. Notes recent improvements in accessibility and potential at the time of writing offered by the AWPR and associated link road to improve access from across the northeast. Nestrans recognises the role of the airport in serving a wide catchment and will ensure that surface access options are available from key towns and settlements, park and ride sites, and via interchanges to enable better access generally. So there is an emphasis on improving access. Strategic objectives for the regional transport strategy include, firstly, to make the movement of goods and people within the northeast to and from the area more efficient and reliable, to reduce the proportion of journeys made by cars, especially single occupant cars, to reduce the environmental impact of transport in line with national targets, to reduce the growth in vehicle kilometres travelled, and to achieve sustained cost and quality advantages for public transport relative to the car. In terms of the local transport strategy, sets out 5 high-level aims. First, a transport system that enables the efficient movement of people and goods, a safe and more secure transport system, a cleaner, greener transport system, an integrated, accessible and socially inclusive transport system, and lastly, a transport system that facilitates healthy and sustainable living. It commits to supporting the development of the airport through delivery of the Aberdeen International Airport Master Plan, and notes that surface access to the airport has improved significantly via new bus services between Dice railway station and the airport, dedicated high-frequency airport buses from Aberdeen city centre, the installation of bus, cycle and taxi lanes on a combined bus, cycle and taxi lane on Argyle Road, and improved walking and cycling infrastructure on Dice Drive, as well as the construction of a new multi-storey car park with dedicated bicycle and motorcycle storage to serve the airport. Also includes an objective to increase public transport patronage by making bus travel an attractive option to all users and competitive with the car in terms of both speed and cost. There's a question of whether the approval of additional off-site car parking to serve the airport would undermine that. So just points to consider in decision making. Firstly, do members feel that the proposal would comply with policy B1 relating to business and industrial areas? The use proposed isn't within classes 4, 5 or 6. However, the policy does indicate that some other types of use consistent with business and industrial areas may be acceptable. How significant would you consider any land use conflict if you perceive one to be? Central to the acceptability of the proposal is its relationship with policies T2 and T3, the associated transport and accessibility supplementary guidance, and the wider considerations of the local and regional transport strategies for the area. Do members feel that the proposal would undermine efforts to effect modal shift and encourage the use of sustainable modes of travel as concluded by the appointed officer? And also, are members satisfied that it's been demonstrated that there's currently a shortage in long stay airport parking that needs to be addressed? You'll note policy B4's requirements for consultation with Aberdeen Airport and the outcome of that consultation in terms of bird hazard management plan, but ultimately no objection. Do members consider that the drainage arrangements would be acceptable in terms of policy NE6? Again, noting that the Council's Roads Development Management team had expressed comfort. So ultimately coming to a conclusion on whether you feel this proposal complies with the development plan. And then from there, are there any other relevant material considerations, for example, SPP and the local and regional transport strategies, which you feel weigh either for or against the proposal? Happy to assist with any questions or with wording of any conditions, and I'll just hand back to you there, Chairperson. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Mr. Evans. Any questions first of all for Mr. Evans? Councillor Duncan?
Can I just clarify whether the original decision maker knew that the air park had shut? That's not new information, is it?
No, that doesn't seem to be new information. No, I think that was made clear in the original submission.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
Councillor Masson, any questions?
No, not at the moment.
Okay. Okay. I haven't got any questions. I think Mr. Evans covered everything quite thoroughly. Thank you. In accordance with the procedure notes circulated, the local review body will now discuss. We've already decided that we will proceed today to make the decision. I will highlight all representations relating to the case have been considered and taken into account. I won't put you first, Councillor Duncan, this time, and given Councillor Mason joined us, obviously fire away, because it's, whilst it on the face of it, it's a car park, but I think it's about understanding all the intricacies that go with it. You know, we've got various things that conflict with numerous things, but I suppose it's about taking it in the round for me. I mean, we heard about the regional transport strategy, which is about mentioned quite heavily the AWPR, and being able to see the connectivity that brings, particularly to the airport. We're all aware of numerous discussions around parking at the airport, particularly there's been reference to costs through this report and the cost of parking at the airport. We've also heard about how we shift or reduce unnecessary traffic movements. What I think goes in the favour of this one in terms of it's not requiring a minibus to be going back and forth to a car park, which is located some distance from the airport. So, you know, there's fors and against this. I mean, I'm struggling because I have a real issue about making sure we have sufficient choice for car parking around the airport, because, you know, we heard a lot about bicycles, but I haven't seen many families arriving at the airport with their suitcases on their bicycles. So, you know, I am thinking about this being used more probably by people who will be looking for car parking of choice, hopefully at an acceptable rate. The fact that they can access it by foot is a bonus for me. I think from a point of B1, I think appropriate conditions around landscaping can mask the site. We have heard another car air park has closed again, which concerns me in that, again, we're reducing the choice for people. I think, you know, when we talk about public transport, again, we have to look at the times the airport opens in the morning and the availability of taxis. If you've got an early flight, which trust me, can be challenging. Particularly again if you're a family all fitting in one taxi, and again I don't think people are going to be getting up at the crack of dawn to get about 3 buses potentially out to the airport. Again, if they're running at that time in the morning, I think that we've got to be realistic in terms of having parking around the airport for people. And I think when we build a massive road which leads there, we're trying to attract more people to use Aberdeen Airport so that it's sustained. I think it's acceptable that we have sufficient choice of car parking. I think for me, this one is more beneficial because we don't have minibus carting you back and forth, you know, which could be about 40, 50, 60, maybe into hundreds of movements back and forth every day. So, you know, I'm actually reasonably comfortable with this application with appropriate conditions. Councillor Duncan, want to?
Yes, I would grant this application. For me, the fact that it's park and walk makes a big difference. I'm also struck by the information on page 134 of the pack from the applicant that, you know, there was a massive increase in public transport use between 2001 and 2018, and new car parks opened at the same time. It went up from 5% to 15%. It's practically at the Nestrans. The use of public transport to go to the airport is practically at the Nestrans target anyway now, and we had 2 long stay car parks plus a massively expanded short stay car park open in that period. I think it is relevant that one of the long stay car parks has now shut, and I'm worried that if we don't replace at least some of that provision, that there will then be huge issues with overskilled car parking in the car parking spaces that have been created for the businesses in the business park around the airport, and also in the residential areas as Stoneywood and Dice. So, and to be honest, the cost of taxis to and from the airport for most of Aberdeen is prohibitive for a lot of people, and the timings don't work. And I'm somebody that uses early morning flights frequently or I did until I was shut in my house for months on end. And you know, public transport for an awful lot of people who live on the outskirts of Aberdeen or in the rural areas just isn't an option, and taxis are too expensive. And I think we'd be denying the reality of many people's lives if we tried to pretend that we could get to minimal car use to get to the airport. I just don't think that's practical. But I think it's good that they're proposing more electric vehicle charging points as well. I do, we have to see it in the round though, and we wouldn't want the existence of a new car park within walking distance of Pecca to be a disincentive to use public transport to Pecca. So I would strongly support a condition that this is airport car parking only. Yeah. And also a condition on landscaping to reduce the visual impact.
Yeah. Councillor Mason.
Yes, thank you, Convener. I don't think you can consider this particular proposal in the light of a normal city development because it's attached to the airport. It has some special considerations which we have to take on board. The fact that there's, as everybody has said, the fact that we're losing car parking space, the airport is important, and we do have to have connections outside the urban areas, which are convenient for bus routes, but for people out in the country, they're totally inconvenient. And on the times I've travelled on the bus link from the centre of this town, it is a very limited number of people who travel on it, and there's no way that anybody could use that. Then, if they have to take a taxi later when they hit the centre of town of Aberdeen, they might as well have taken a taxi straight away. So use of a car is an essential process for people using the airport. The fact that there are electrical charging points, the fact that you don't need a shuttle bus, are all indications that this is a valid scheme as they're proposed. I mean, it will be necessary to put conditions on. I think the landscaping is important, that we get something which shields the generality of a mass car parking space, which as such very unattractive. So suitable landscaping is necessary, and the safety and conditions as well as being the condition that it's only airport passengers which can use it. Quite how at the end of the day you enforce that, I'm not quite sure, but I think if that is a condition, at least they can be pulled to account if necessary. So overall, and it's an airport-based development, not general city development. I think we should allow this appeal to go through with necessary number of conditions.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Mason. So I think we're all of a similar mind that we can see the benefits to the wider economy as well, because we do want to make sure that our airport is competitive with other airports and attract more people to it. You know, we often hear that our flights are more expensive than Edinburgh and Glasgow, etc. And what we don't want to do is then make it even harder for people to be able to park, given we've lost spaces there. So I think with the condition that the airport asked on Gavin, which is about the protection near bird stuff, the landscape condition, and the airport only condition. Did you say anything, Gavin, about the drainage?
Yes, there were drainage arrangements submitted with the proposal. Ultimately, it's to remain a private system, and the surface water would just discharge to the ground beneath the porous parking spaces. So I suppose what you might do is just put on a condition requiring that the proposal be implemented, or the consent be implemented in accordance with the details that we've already been shown on that front. And
is there anything else that you think we've missed?
The ones I'd made note of were the detailed landscaping scheme to be agreed before works start and implementation thereafter, drainage arrangements implemented per the submission, installation of EV or electric vehicle charging points prior to the use commencing, airport parking only restriction. You might want to secure a sort of a statement from the applicant in terms of how exactly that would operate, and then have them undertake the use in accordance with that agreed statement. The bird hazard management plan. So I think that was 5.
Yeah.
And what I can do is come up with some wording and just circulate that to members for your agreement before decision notice goes out.
That's super. Thank you. Mr. Masson, that's a unanimous decision with those appropriate conditions. Do you need anything else from us?
No, that's fine. I've just recorded that the members have overturned the officer's decision to refuse the application unanimously with those 5 conditions to be added.
Okay, super. Okay, well, that's it. And that concludes the LRB for today. Obviously, Councillor Mason and Councillor Duncan will come back to you about the Bridge of Dawn one, and we can rearrange that once we get the necessary paperwork. But thank you all for your attendance today. Thank you, Alan. Thanks, Gavin. Thanks, Mark. And that concludes today. Thank you.
Thank you all. Bye now.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye.